The first-class cabin glowed under the polished lights, the seats upholstered in luxurious leather, the wheels of a suitcase rolling silently over the thick carpet as usual. But then, the atmosphere was shattered by a sharp, acidic voice, so clear that even passengers folding their newspapers had to look up. "What are you doing here? This seat isn't for people like you." A stiff ticket was thrown back, hitting the chest of a black man sitting perfectly composed in seat 2 Ampere. The dry, slapping sound was cold and distinct. Immediately, all eyes were on him. A few people nearby raised their eyebrows, others hid a smirk, but most pretended not to see. The man's name was David Carter, 43 years old. A CEO, known in the business world as someone who never took a back seat to anyone. But right now, in the expensive airplane cabin, where he had every right to be, he was being treated like an outsider, an imposter. The flight attendant stood tall, her lips curled into a thin, contemptuous smile. She spoke loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Do you think just anyone can sit in first class? Don't turn this into a joke." The air grew heavy. An elderly couple behind him leaned in and whispered, "We've seen it many times. Everyone wants to sneak into first class." A man in a suit in the opposite seat shook his head and pulled out his phone, as if this were some in-flight entertainment. David remained still, his hands resting neatly on his lap, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the space in front of him. He didn't react, didn't get angry, but his very silence made him seem even more like a cornered, powerless man. Amidst the whispers, David could feel the eyes of every person sweeping over him, as if he were an obstacle, someone who didn't belong. They didn't see him as a person, but as a nuisance to be removed as quickly as possible. The flight attendant took another step, her voice higher, colder. "Do you hear me? This is not your seat. Get out, before I have security drag you out." Her cold eyes seemed to pierce right through his heart. A few passengers let out small laughs, while others turned away, pretending to be engrossed in the television screens in front of them to avoid getting involved. David took a deep breath, a familiar feeling rising in him. The humiliation of being treated as invisible, as someone of no value. He had spent his entire life proving he wasn't inferior, wasn't small, but right here, in the first-class cabin he had paid for, he was still being trampled by the ice-cold stares and attitudes of a group of strangers. If you have ever experienced a similar moment being pushed out, being treated as if you don't meet the standards to be where you are, please leave a comment. Perhaps that very feeling, the one David is enduring, will touch a memory of your own. The heavy thud of shoes on the floor announced the arrival of a security officer. His muscular frame seemed to fill the entire aisle. His voice was firm, sharp. "Sir, you need to gather your things. This is not your seat." Once again, everyone looked at David as if he were a criminal caught in the act. The phones were raised higher, recording every second. The injustice was no longer a private matter between him and the flight attendant. It had become a public spectacle for the entire cabin. David still hadn't moved. He could feel the coldness in every gaze, in every cheap whisper. The man in the opposite seat smirked. People think money can buy anything. Every word was a knife twisting in his pride. But have you noticed? The more people pushed, the more they wanted him to disappear from that seat. The calmer David's expression became, as if he were waiting for a moment, for something that would turn the tables. And I think that many of you listening to this story have, at least once, felt pushed out, treated as unworthy in a space you worked hard to earn. If you see yourself in this situation, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more powerful stories about justice, honor, and the strength of silence. The entire cabin was silent, as if waiting for an explosion. The sharp gaze of the security officer, the contemptuous smile of the flight attendant, the snickers of a few passengers. It all created a raw truth. David Carter was being removed, neutralized in a space where he was not only worthy, but irreplaceable. David remained still in seat 2 Ampere. The ticket lay on his lap, a piece of evidence no one bothered to look at. The eyes of those around him were fixed on him, cold and disdainful, as if he were a seat thief. In that moment, memories flooded his mind. He remembered being a skinny black kid, standing silently in someone else's kitchen, while his mother, a frail woman who worked as a maid for a wealthy family, was being yelled at by her employer for misplacing a glass. The young David had wanted to run to his mother, to hug her, but she had shaken her head, signaling for him to be quiet. "Don't say a word, son. It doesn't matter what they think, as long as we live with dignity." Oh, those words were etched in his memory. But the pain of being looked down on, of being treated as inferior, had turned into a fire. He studied day and night, worked odd jobs to get a scholarship, and struggled his way into college. Once, a classmate had looked at him and laughed. "Did you get in on a special program? You probably won't last long." David didn't answer. He just clenched his fists and promised himself he would prove them wrong. And he did. Step by step, day by day, he moved forward. After graduation, he started his own business with nothing. Evenings of instant noodles, days of being rejected for loans, cold handshakes from investors. He clearly remembered one meeting where a potential partner looked him in the eye and said, "You're smart, but I don't believe a man like you can lead a company." At the time, he had just smiled, but inside, every word had carved another vow into his heart. "One day, I will sit at the highest table, and then they will have no way to deny me." And he had done it. The Carter Group was born. From a small office, the company grew, becoming one of the most influential aviation investment firms. David stood on stage to accept the Entrepreneur of the Year award, the handshakes from those who had once doubted him now firm with respect. He had it all: money, power, fame, but in this first-class cabin this morning, amidst the contemptuous gazes and condescending voices, all of it suddenly seemed to disappear. A flight attendant sneakily raised her phone, recording the scene as if it were an amusing anecdote to share with her colleagues later. A smug smile was still on her face. A few passengers muttered, "They just think they can sit wherever they want. I wonder if the ticket is fake, or if he borrowed it from someone." Oh, the whispers reminded David of the day he was 15, when a security guard had dragged him out of a supermarket because they thought he was stealing. He had done nothing wrong, but they just needed to see his skin color, his old clothes, and it was enough to convict him. That feeling of being excluded, of being neutralized in front of a crowd, it was back, in its entirety. Have you ever been through something similar? A moment when you knew you were right, you had the right, but you were still treated as if you didn't belong. If so, I'd love for you to leave a comment, to see that we are not alone in those memories. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He was no longer that young boy. He was a CEO, a man who had spoken before hundreds of business leaders, who had signed contracts that the entire aviation industry had to respect. But the bitter truth was, with just one contemptuous glance, one cold voice, he was still being pushed back into that same low place from his past. This truth is what makes it hard for the audience to escape a sense of unease, because it proves that in life, status and money can't always protect a person from prejudice and disrespect. In the cabin, the security officer was still standing in front of him, gesturing. "Get up now. We don't want to make this difficult, but you don't have a choice." The entire crowd watched him as if he were about to be dragged away, and once again, David's silence was confounding. No reaction, no resistance, just a gaze as cold as a frozen lake, hiding a storm within. And in that moment, the audience watching this video will also be asking, who is he? Why is a man with such a calm demeanor, such a proud gaze, being treated so cruelly? If you want to hear more real-life stories like this, stories with a powerful message about injustice, please subscribe to the channel. It's not just a click, It's a way of joining a conversation that makes people rethink fairness and respect. David opened his eyes. His back was still straight. He was no longer the poor boy in the smoky kitchen. He was no longer the doubted student or the rejected entrepreneur. He was David Carter, a man who had earned his place, a place anyone should respect. But in this first-class cabin today, all of that was being wiped away by the indifference of a crowd. He sat there, as silent as a rock, while the storm around him grew. Beat by beat, the sound of shoes on the carpeted floor echoed through the first-class cabin. 2 more security officers appeared, their large frames blocking the aisle. You didn't need to look closely to know what was about to happen. The lead officer's voice was firm, as sharp as a knife. You are not permitted to be in this seat. Gather your belongings immediately. You are not permitted to be in this seat. The flight attendant who had started it all crossed her arms, leaning against a nearby seat, a smirk on her face. She said, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, "What a waste of time. A man like you is probably used to economy. This is first class, not a place to try your luck." The air was so heavy that even the other passengers seemed uncomfortable. But instead of standing up for David, they chose a different path. Some pulled out their phones and started recording. A few nodded, as if justice were finally being served. The man in seat 1C whispered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A classic case. Thinks a nice suit is enough to sneak into first class." And the woman next to him nodded without a second thought. "They always do this." So annoying. David heard it all. Each word was a pinprick, but he didn't respond. Instead, he looked directly at the flight attendant, the one who had just humiliated him in front of everyone, and his eyes were so cold that she flinched for a moment. But then, the smirk returned. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "The more you stay silent, the more everyone sees you have nothing to prove." A few small laughs came from the back. The laughter was quiet, but it echoed so loudly that David felt as if the entire cabin were mocking him. He turned to his right, where a middle-aged man was shaking his head and sighing, then said to his companion, "What a nuisance. If you can't afford it, just accept it. Why try so hard?" That comment made David's heart clench. No one needed to know the truth. No one bothered to check. All they needed was to believe what they saw, and what they saw was a black man in a first-class seat, which in their eyes was already proof of deceit. The security officer's voice hardened. "This is your last warning. Get up, or we will be forced to remove you." David looked down at the ticket on his lap. A real ticket, bought with his own money. He had every right to be here, but in that moment, it was all meaningless. No one cared about the ticket. No one wanted an explanation. They just wanted him to disappear. And that was the greatest humiliation. To be denied the right to exist, to have your very presence erased in a space you had paid to be in. Have you ever been in that situation? Knowing you are right, but being pushed by a group until you have no voice. If so, please leave a comment. Maybe you will see that you are not the only one who has been pushed to the margins like this. In the cabin, the atmosphere was clearly divided. One group of passengers was casually watching this as entertainment. Another group was silent, avoiding David's gaze, as if staying out of it would keep them safe. And a few, their eyes showed a flicker of doubt, but then they too looked down, pretending not to see. The flight attendant didn't miss her chance. She pulled out her phone, discreetly started recording, and lowered her voice. But just enough for the microphone to pick it up. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, there are always people who want to take what doesn't belong to them." A phone screen flashed, and a few snickers came from the back. No one intervened. No one stood up to defend him. David lifted his head, and his eyes swept across the cabin. All these strange faces, people who had no idea who he was, what his life was like. But with a single glance, a single prejudice, They were ready to cast him out. A strange feeling rose in him, no longer just anger, but a deep bitterness. After all these years of climbing, from a disrespected child to a man at the top, he was still being treated as a fraud. Another voice came from the back row. An older woman's, "Just get him out of here. The rest of us are waiting to take off." That comment was the final seal. The cabin grew noisy, and all eyes were now on David. No one asked him how he had bought the ticket. No one needed to verify. To them, the conclusion was clear. He did not belong here. David sat motionless, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He was not a man who would back down. But what hurt him the most wasn't being kicked out of his seat. It was the feeling of being stripped of his right to exist in a place where he should have been respected. In moments like this, the audience can see a clearer truth. The silence of a crowd is often crueler than a direct insult. The flight attendant smirked and turned to another staff member. "Call the captain. We can't wait any longer." David heard every word, and he knew this was the turning point of the story. He took a deep breath, his eyes still holding that terrifying calm. No resistance, no pleading, just a gaze that made others shudder. He was waiting for things to go far enough, for the raw truth to be fully exposed, and in that tense atmosphere, so thick you could cut it with a knife, no one present knew that with the appearance of just one small detail, the entire situation would change forever. David sat motionless, a rock in the turbulent first-class cabin. Around him, the cold stares and whispers were a constant assault. "He definitely doesn't have a real ticket. Look at him. It's so obvious. They shouldn't let him sit here. It cheapens the whole cabin." Every word, every sound, was a needle in his chest. He wanted to scream, to throw the real ticket in their faces, to force them to be silent. But then, he didn't. Instead, he relaxed his shoulders, took a long breath, and half closed his eyes. The anger was still boiling inside, but on the outside, his face was a cold, uncrackable mask. It was his silence that confused them. A few passengers looked at each other and frowned. They were used to seeing resistance, arguments, but this quiet, restrained stillness made them feel as if they had just touched a dark, deep abyss. David remembered his childhood nights, when his mother would come home from a long, exhausting shift. Her clothes were worn, her hands calloused, but she always managed to smile. "Don't let them see your pain, David," she had once told him. "When you are silent, they will never know how strong you are." Those words echoed in his mind now. He had learned to endure. He was used to the doubtful glances, the dismissive attitudes. But being used to it didn't mean it didn't hurt, because in every one of those contemptuous looks, he saw his mother's shadow, saw his past self, a child who just wanted to be acknowledged as good enough to exist. The flight attendant leaned in, her voice haughty. "What are you waiting for?" "We can't waste any more time. He has to leave." A few people clapped sporadically, as if cheering for order to be restored. David opened his eyes. His gaze swept across the cabin, and no words were needed. A few people instinctively looked down, avoiding his eyes. An old man pressed his lips together, about to say something, then stopped. His silence at this point was no longer just endurance. It had become a mirror, reflecting the cowardice of the crowd. Inside, his heart was pounding, not from fear, but from an anger so suppressed it felt like his chest would explode. But he knew that if he erupted now, he would lose. They wanted to see him scream. They wanted to record a man losing control, and he would not give them that satisfaction. He closed his eyes again. A quiet thought drifted through his mind. Maybe millions of people out there have felt this same way, pushed aside, judged, just because they were different from the majority. If you are listening and see yourself in this, please leave a comment, because maybe you will realize that you are not the only one who has been treated as if you don't deserve to be present. The flight attendant urged the security officer again. "Get up. Other people have to fly. He's disturbing everyone." David opened his eyes. His voice was low, clear, but not loud. "I am not disturbing anyone. I am just sitting in my rightful place." No one responded. Just a few whispers, a few small laughs, but his words and his calm made the atmosphere soften for a few seconds. A young woman in the back row muttered, just loud enough for the person next to her to hear, "But he doesn't seem like a liar." Her words were quickly drowned out by other, harsher voices. "Don't be fooled. They're good at pretending." David was silent again. But this time, a strange light flickered in his eyes. It was no longer the look of a cornered man, but of someone preparing for a counterattack. Because, in his silence, he had made a decision. He would not leave. He would not let anyone erase his existence. Not here. Not today. If you believe that moments of injustice like this need to be remembered, need to be exposed so that no one else has to endure them, please subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, just by hearing a story, we find the strength to stand firm in the face of denial. David relaxed his shoulders, straightened his back, and his eyes grew as sharp as a blade. The whole cabin was still talking, still treating him as an outsider. But in that moment, he no longer felt small. He knew the truth would soon be revealed, and when it was, every one of those contemptuous gazes would have to look down. Not because he screamed, not because he begged, but because he chose to be silent and wait for the right moment, for everything to be turned upside down. The noise in the first-class cabin rose like a wave, the mocking words, the quiet laughter, the phone secretly recording. It all swirled around David in an invisible vortex. The security officer leaned down, his hand resting on the armrest. "This is your last chance. Get up. We will not repeat ourselves." David lifted his head. His expression was unchanged, but there was a glint in his eye that made the man in front of him pause for a moment. He slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket. The small movement was enough to make the entire cabin tense up. A few people flinched, and someone even whispered, "What is he doing?" It wasn't a passport. It wasn't a wallet. David pulled out a small black leather case, opened it, and then slowly placed it on the folding table in front of him. Not a word of explanation, just a business card, lying there, its silver edges gleaming under the light. The man sitting next to him happened to see the text on it and almost dropped his phone. His eyes went wide, his mouth moved, but no sound came out. The flight attendant walked over, ready to deliver another taunt. But when her eyes fell on the business card, her face froze. The condescending smile vanished. On the card, printed clearly, without any frills, were the words, "David Carter, Chairman, CEO, Carter Aviation Group." The entire cabin seemed to freeze for a few seconds. The chatter stopped. The person who had been filming lowered their phone, their hand trembling. A young passenger whispered to his companion, "Oh my God, that name, isn't that the company that owns a fleet of this airline's planes?" His friend replied, his voice shaking, "Yes, that's them. He's the CEO of that company." The atmosphere exploded. The people who had just been mocking him now looked at each other, their faces changing color. The old woman who had urged them to kick David out now shrank in her seat, staring at the floor. The security officer didn't fully understand, but the drastic change in the passenger's attitude made him instinctively take a step back. David lifted his head, his voice low and sharp, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I am sitting in my rightful seat, but instead of verifying that, you chose to humiliate me in front of everyone. And now, I think it's time you all knew who I am." The cabin held its breath. The earlier insults now felt like blades hanging over the heads of those who had mocked him. A figure appeared at the entrance of the cabin, the captain. He walked quickly, his eyes scanning the passengers, the security officer, and then finally landing on the business card. In that instant, The color drained from his face. His eyes were wide with shock. His voice choked as he whispered, "Mr. Carter." Just 2 words, but they were enough to send a shockwave through the cabin. The flight attendant went pale and backed away. The flight manager swallowed hard, his hands trembling. The passengers who had looked at David with such coldness were now completely silent, trying to avoid his gaze. David said nothing more. He just sat up straight, his sharp eyes sweeping over each person. His silence was no longer endurance. It was a statement that the game had changed, and everyone understood. From the moment the captain uttered that name, no one in this cabin would ever dare to see David Carter as someone who didn't belong. The first-class cabin was dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the engines outside. But in this enclosed space, every breath was audible. The captain stood at attention, his face still pale with shock. He bowed his head, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Carter, I had no idea. Please, accept my sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding." The security officers exchanged a confused glance. One of them lowered his voice, trying to maintain a professional tone. "We were just following the flight attendant's report." All eyes immediately turned to her. The woman who had been so arrogant, so confidently filming, was now trembling. Her phone silently turned off. Her face was ashen, and she stammered, I just thought he..." David cut her off, his voice cold, not loud, but as clear as a command. "You didn't think. You judged. You humiliated. And you did it publicly, in front of everyone." The tension was thick. The man in seat 1C, who had sneered about his nice suit, now lowered his head, quietly locking his phone. The old woman who had demanded David be removed now clutched her husband's hand, her face flushed with shame. David turned and looked directly at the flight manager. His voice was even, each word like a hammer blow. "Get the regional director on the phone. Now. I want a decision made on the spot." The manager froze, his lips trembling. The captain quickly nodded and pulled out his phone. The entire cabin held its breath, waiting. No one dared to say another word. Just a few minutes later, a voice came through the speakerphone, firm and panicked when he heard what had happened. "Mr. Carter, I am so sorry. Everything you require will be done immediately. The flight attendant's contract is terminated. The flight manager is suspended pending an investigation, and we will issue a public apology within 24 hours. The cabin erupted. Many passengers let out a sharp breath. A few whispered, "Unbelievable." The man in seat 1C silently locked his phone, not daring to look up. The young woman in the back, the only one who had questioned what was happening, gave a small, relieved smile. David didn't look triumphant. He just gave a slight nod, his expression still cold. "A wise decision, but please remember, this isn't just about me. It's about how you treat anyone you deem not good enough." A round of applause started, at first from a single man with dark skin in the back row. Then it slowly spread, filling the cabin. No one stood up, but the sound was a resonant wave, breaking the heavy atmosphere. The flight attendant was pale, her hands clenched, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something. But then she fell silent. It was too late. David tilted his head and looked out at the crowd. His voice was no longer sharp, but deep, intimate, as if he were speaking to each person individually. "You have all just witnessed a raw truth. When we are too quick to judge, too quick to cast someone out, we can destroy their dignity in a matter of minutes. But what's even more terrifying is the silence that allows humiliation to become normal." The cabin was completely quiet. The old woman had tears in her eyes. A young man whispered, "He's right. I've been silent like that in the face of injustice before." David gave a slight nod. He didn't need anyone to defend him, but he wanted them to realize that they, too, had played a part in what had happened. He turned back and sat up straight. His eyes were no longer burning with anger, but were bright with resolve. The captain bowed his head again. "Mr. Carter, with your permission, we will proceed with the flight. Everything will be handled as promised." David nodded, his reply short, cold, and final. "Fly." The cabin seemed to let out a collective sigh of relief, but the echo of what had happened remained. The shame, the awakening, and the haunting realization that a single wrong judgment could push a person to the brink of humiliation. "Mr. Carter, thank you, not just for defending yourself, but for saying what so many of us have been through, but never had the courage to say." David gave a slight nod without turning around. The words were a confession for everyone. That silence is sometimes crueler than a direct insult. A young woman whispered, "I thought you were in the wrong, just because everyone else's looks made me believe it. It turns out, I was a part of your humiliation too." Her voice was choked but honest. Many in the cabin lowered their heads, some even shedding a quiet tear, not out of pity for David, but because they recognized how many times they, too, had been silent in the face of similar injustices in their own lives. David turned, and for the first time since it all began, his voice was deep, clear, each word as heavy as a vow. "I don't need anyone to bow to me. I just need everyone to understand. No one has the right to erase a person's existence just because they think he doesn't belong." Not a sound. The first-class cabin was now a room full of people in self-reflection. If you are listening to this story, perhaps you, too, have experienced a moment of exclusion, of denial, of being treated as an outsider. If so, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment, because maybe your story will make someone else feel they are not alone. David returned to his seat, silent. But this time, the silence was different. It no longer held the bitter taste of endurance. It held the weight of a message, one that the people in this cabin would never forget. The plane shuddered and accelerated. As the wheels left the ground, the passengers felt as if they had just witnessed not just a flight, but a transformation. A passenger whispered, "We will never forget this day." No more words were needed. The story had already been seared into the memory of everyone present. David leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the image of his mother from years ago, smiling gently after a long, hard day. If she were alive, she would be proud. Not because her son was a CEO, but because today, he had not only defended himself, but had also awakened an entire crowd. If you believe that stories like this need to be shared, so that more people know that justice can be reclaimed, please subscribe to the channel. Because only when we share due injustices have no place left to hide. The plane soared, piercing through a thick layer of clouds. In the cabin, no one dared to say anything more, but there was a silent consensus. From now on, they would never again judge a person just by their appearance. As for David, he didn't need applause. He didn't need praise. He just needed one thing: respect. And in that moment, he knew he had won it back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been looked down on.